The dancing plague of Strasbourg, a city that danced itself to the brink of collapse. It's a historical mystery, and it defies any simple explanation. Fear and belief can physically rewrite reality for an entire community. People kept dancing long after their bodies gave out. This was a 500-year-old panic. And it reveals something about our own minds today. What does it mean when a society literally cannot stop moving? The year was 1518. Strasbourg was a free city, part of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a center for trade and printing. People there had a kind of liberty you didn't find in a lot of other places, but that liberty came with a deep uncertainty. This was a time of relentless hardship. The harvests had failed more than once, food was scarce, prices were high, malnutrition was everywhere, it weakened people. And then there was the sickness, smallpox, syphilis. These outbreaks moved through the crowded streets. There was a big gap, too, between the wealthy and the poor. And over all of it was this religious anxiety. This was just before Martin Luther and his 95 Theses. The church's authority was being questioned. People lived with a real fear of divine punishment for their sins, so in that world, misfortune wasn't random, a failed crop, a sudden fever, a personal loss. These were seen as signs, punishment from God or from some malicious spirit. The people of Strasbourg were hungry, they were sick, and they were ready to see catastrophe. In every shadow, that collective mindset, the fear, the superstition, the physical suffering, it created the exact conditions where something as strange as a dancing plague could start. And then spread like fire through dry timber. The stage was set, and the first person was about to step into it from the most ordinary place. Mid-July in Strasbourg, the heat was heavy. A woman, Frau Troffea, came out onto her narrow street, and she started to dance. It wasn't joyful. There was no music. Her movements were frantic, relentless, this desperate kind of jig. It didn't seem like her own will. She danced alone, and she couldn't stop. Her husband pleaded. Neighbors came, curious at first, then alarmed. Hours went, then a full day. Her feet blistered and bled on the stones, but she kept dancing. Days of it, this solitary, compulsive performance, a disturbing spectacle against the ordinary life of the city. That was the spark. Within a week, the impossible happened. It wasn't solitary anymore. Dozens of others, men and women, found themselves seized by the same compulsion. They joined her in the streets, moving in that same frantic, exhausted rhythm. A crowd now dancing toward collapse. The city council was baffled, fearing chaos. They consulted the physicians. The diagnosis, by the medical wisdom of the time, was straightforward. The problem was overheated blood. The theory was an imbalance in the body's humors. Blood grown too hot and wild could force the limbs into a frenzy. A logical explanation for an illogical event. So based on that, the authorities prescribed their cure. They reasoned if the dance was from overheated blood, the dancers must dance the fever out. They would lean into it, not fight it. They cleared public spaces. They hired musicians for lively tunes. They built wooden stages to give the sufferers a proper platform. The plan was to let them dance the sickness away, to purge the bad blood through continuous, guided motion. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. By sanctioning the dance, by giving it space and a soundtrack, the city didn't contain the panic. It institutionalized it. They mistook the symptom for the cure, and in doing that, they poured oil onto a fire already burning out of control. The stage they put up in the horse market. It became this new center for the city, a terrible one. Musicians were playing these lively songs, but it wasn't for a celebration. It was a prescribed cure. They even hired professional dancers to lead it, to show people the frenzy they were trying to stop. The logic was simple and tragic. If the body's blood was overheated, causing this mania, then the only cure was to burn the fever out through motion. You dance until you collapse, you dance until the sickness is gone. It was a medical order from the authorities meant to heal, but in practice it was permission for madness. By giving the plague a stage, they made it legitimate. What had been a terrifying, private thing for Frau Troffea was now a public event, sanctioned. The music gave the chaos a rhythm. The professionals being there made it seem almost normal, something to join, not to run from, and the crowds came. Not just the afflicted, but hundreds of onlookers drawn to the spectacle. Their fearful attention, that collective energy, it fed back into the dancers. A single person's private breakdown is a tragedy. 100 people dancing together, encouraged by their leaders, becomes a movement. The city's attempt to control the outbreak became the thing that amplified it. They had mistaken the symptom for the disease. Trying to purge the fever, they poured fuel on the fire. This wasn't just a medical mystery anymore. It was a social crisis, engineered by the people who were supposed to solve it. And as the days became weeks, the true cost of that mistake became clear. It showed on the bodies of the dancers themselves. The cure they ordered became a public torment. You could see it. Those dancers on the stages weren't celebrating. They were in agony. Their feet were swollen, torn. Their faces were just masks of exhaustion and terror, stuck in a rhythm they couldn't escape. Some would collapse, then the music would start again and they'd have to get up. Others danced until their hearts just stopped. The city leaders watched. And a terrible realization began to form. Their medical intervention wasn't working. It was making everything worse. People weren't being cured. They were being broken, right in public, and it was all called treatment. So the stages came down, the musicians were sent away, the official sanction was revoked, but by then it was too late. The behavior had been validated. The phenomenon had its own life now. With the stages gone, the dancing just spilled back into the streets and the squares. It was more chaotic than before. The authorities were left with a city in the grip of something they couldn't understand, and they couldn't stop it, not with the tools they had. That forced a final, desperate shift in their thinking. If medicine had failed, then this wasn't a sickness of the body. It had to be a sickness of the soul, a divine punishment, or maybe a demonic one. So the hunt for a cause turned from the physical world to the spiritual. That set the stage for the explanations that would echo for centuries, which brings us to the first modern attempt to solve it, the famous one. For a long time, the main scientific theory pointed straight at the bread. Specifically, a toxic fungus that grows on damp rye grain, ergot. When you eat it, ergot produces powerful compounds, alkaloids. They're chemically similar to the substance we know as LSD. The symptoms of ergot poisoning ergotism can include muscle spasms, vivid hallucinations, a crawling, burning feeling in the skin. To some researchers, this seemed to fit. The compulsive movements, the trance-like states people described, it could all be explained by a city-wide case of accidental mass poisoning. A bad batch of rye bread, and an entire population trips into a shared nightmare. It's a compelling explanation, almost cinematic, but when you look closer, the pieces don't quite align. Historical accounts of ergotism from that same period describe something far more gruesome and less coordinated. The condition was often called St. Anthony's fire, named for the searing pain, the black, gangrenous decay it could cause in limbs. Victims suffered convulsions, yes, but not the sustained, rhythmic dancing that went on for days and nights in Strasbourg. And the Strasbourg records are strangely silent on these other symptoms. No mentions of widespread loss of limbs, no talk of that characteristic burning agony that defined ergotism outbreaks. If the whole city was eating poisoned bread, where were all the other victims? That glaring absence has led most historians and scientists to doubt ergot as the sole culprit. It might have been a factor, weakening a stressed population. But it fails to explain the specific social nature of the event, why it manifested as dance, why it spread through sight and suggestion. Ruling out a simple physical poison doesn't solve the mystery, though. It just pushes us toward a more complex frontier, the human mind itself, and its power to shape reality for an entire community. The city was stuck with something medicine couldn't solve. If it wasn't poison in the bread, then what? The answer might not be in the body. It might be in the mind, the collective mind, which brings us to the main modern explanation. A psychological framework called mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, though that's not quite accurate. It's the idea that physical symptoms without a clear medical cause can move through a group. Under extreme shared stress, think of it not as a virus but as a kind of emotional contagion. In Strasbourg, all the ingredients were there, that deep, city-wide fear. The constant hunger from the failed harvests, the religious guilt that framed every hardship as punishment. The community was a pressure cooker of anxiety. No release valve, and then one person, Frau Troffea, found a valve. Her frantic dancing wasn't random. In that time and place, dance had a dual meaning. It was social, but it was also a form of religious expression, a form of penance. There were known Saint Vitus's dances where people moved in spiritual fervor. So when she started, she wasn't just breaking down, she was performing a recognizable cultural script, an extreme one. Her movements gave a shape to the invisible panic everyone felt. She provided a template, and in a community primed for catastrophe, that template spread, not through germs or toxins, through sight, through suggestion. That's the mechanism of social contagion. We're wired to unconsciously mimic the people around us, to sync up with their emotional states. It's why a yawn is contagious. Why laughter spreads in a room. Normally, this helps us bond, but in Strasbourg, under that immense psychological weight, the mechanism short-circuited. People saw the dancing, their own pent-up terror, their physical exhaustion found a mirror. Their brains, seeking an outlet for the unbearable tension, latched onto that behavior. It became a permissible way to scream, a devastating way, but a way to scream without making a sound. The mind's power over the body is astonishing in these collective moments. It can manifest real physical suffering from purely psychological distress. We see echoes of this throughout history, not with dancing but with other unexplained symptoms. There's the laughing epidemic in Tanganyika in the 1960s, laughter and fainting spreading through a school for months, or more recent events where groups of students suddenly experienced dizziness or nausea. No environmental cause ever found. These aren't fakes. The people are in genuine distress. Their symptoms are real. The origin is just in the shared psyche. Not in a lab test, so mass psychogenic illness doesn't dismiss the suffering of the dancers. It takes it seriously. It suggests their pain was the city's pain made physical. Their exhausted bodies were acting out a communal cry for help. A cry no one knew how to hear, but even this powerful psychological model leaves a haunting question unanswered. It explains how the behavior spread. It doesn't fully explain why it started with that specific woman on that specific day, or why the chosen expression was dance and not some other frantic action. To get closer to that why, we have to look beyond psychology alone, into the very fabric of the world those people believed they lived in, a world where the spiritual and the physical weren't separate realms. They were tangled together in every moment. That missing piece might be in the name itself, Saint Vitus's dance in 1518. That name wasn't random. It was a diagnosis of the soul. Medieval Europe saw the body as a spiritual battleground, a seizure, a sudden movement. These weren't just malfunctions. They were messages or maybe invasions. Saint Vitus was a martyr, and over time he became the patron saint invoked against epilepsy, against nervous disorders, against these strange dancing sicknesses. To call it that Saint Vitus's dance was to place it in a spiritual context immediately. It said this was about more than blood, more than bread. this was about sin. About salvation, some historians look at Strasbourg and they don't see a disease. They see a desperate form of worship, a choreomania. The idea of dance as penance has deep roots. There were traditions of ritual dancing on saints' days, processions where communities moved together to honor something divine or to avert disaster. In a time of relentless suffering, what if the people of Strasbourg internalized the belief that they were being punished? The failed crops, the sickness, these were signs of a wrathful God. And so in a terrible, unconscious logic, they began to perform the punishment upon themselves. Their dancing became a frantic, collective ritual of atonement. They were trying to dance off the sin, to exhaust the divine anger through their own physical collapse. That transforms the event from a medical mystery into a cultural one. In this view, the dancers weren't just victims of a toxin or a psychological breakdown. They were participants in a terrible ceremony, a ceremony with its own twisted rules. There are accounts from the time of people making pilgrimages to shrines of Saint Vitus, seeking cures. The pilgrimage itself was a kind of prescribed, orderly dance, a journey of suffering meant to lead to healing. In Strasbourg, the pilgrimage collapsed inward. The shrine came to them. It came in the form of their own tortured bodies, right there in the public square. The music the city provided, the stages they built, these might have been tragically misinterpreted, not as a medical treatment, but as a sanctioned part of the ritual. The authorities were essentially providing the soundtrack and the temple for a mass penance they didn't understand. This perspective helps explain the why that psychology alone struggles with. Why dance? Because in that specific cultural moment, dance was a language they knew for speaking to the divine. It was a recognized form of spiritual expression, pushed to a horrifying extreme. The first dancer, Frau Troffea, she wasn't inventing a new behavior from nothing. She was tapping into a deep, pre-existing script in the medieval mind. A script that said when the world is falling apart, your body must move to make it right. Her private crisis became a public liturgy because the community shared the same belief system. They recognized the performance, even in its terrifying form, and some felt compelled to join in. Their participation was a form of prayer, a scream for mercy written in motion. So we have three layers now, each one partially illuminating the truth. A possible physical trigger, the famine, the illness, a powerful psychological mechanism, social contagion under extreme stress. And finally, a specific cultural and religious vessel that gave the chaos its shape, the concept of Saint Vitus's dance as penance. None of these explanations cancels the others out. Instead, they stack together, each one turning up the pressure on a city already at its breaking point. The real horror of Strasbourg may be this convergence. It was a perfect storm where the body, the mind, and the spirit all broke down in unison, using the only shared language they had, a dance toward oblivion. That leaves one final layer to consider, not what happened then, but what it means for us now, how a 500-year-old panic echoes in our own world. In social media, in digital crowds, there was a fourth layer to this storm. It wasn't about the spirit or the mind or the body alone. It was about the city itself. How it was built, Strasbourg had these sharp, visible divides. On one side, the wealthy merchants, the clergy, living in comfort. On the other, this vast underclass. Laborers, peasants, people working land that wouldn't feed them, building wealth they could never touch. The harvests didn't create that inequality, they just exposed it. Like a bone breaking through skin, for most people in Strasbourg, poverty wasn't a temporary thing. It was the cage they were born into, and the walls kept getting higher. That creates a specific despair, a deep, grinding resentment, and a profound helplessness. What do you do when the system is rigged, when protest could mean ruin? When your voice isn't heard, your body might find another way to speak. That's where the dancing takes on a new dimension. Some historians see it not just as illness or penance. but as a form of protest, a non-verbal protest, a physical scream against conditions words couldn't describe. The compulsive movement becomes a metaphor made flesh. The body manifesting its own trapped energy, its own inability to escape. You can't flee your social station. You can't eat when there's no food, but you can move. You can dance until you collapse, performing your exhaustion, your rage on a public stage. A stage the authorities themselves provided. In a society that tightly controlled behavior, this uncontrollable dance was a rebellion. The last resort, a breakdown that was also paradoxically communication. It forced the powerful to look. It forced the city to witness the cost of its own structure. So the stages in the horse market become something darker, not just sites of failed treatment, but theaters where the city's deepest social fractures were acted out in real time. By bodies pushed past their limits, this view ties the event directly to the political and economic pressures of the era. It says mass psychogenic illness doesn't happen in a vacuum. It needs a host, a society under specific, unbearable strains. The dancing was a symptom of a sick social body, not just sick individuals. It's what happened when economic despair, with no outlet, no solution, finally boiled over into physical reality. We see echoes of this elsewhere, in other times, other places, where collective stress from social injustice manifests in unexplained physical symptoms. The body keeps the score. Sometimes an entire population's score is written in movements of pure, desperate fatigue, so the picture is almost complete. A city stressed by famine and disease, a population primed by religious fear, a psychological mechanism for contagion, a cultural script of dance as penance. And underpinning it all, a socioeconomic engine of despair that gave the crisis its terrible, relentless fuel. All these forces converged on Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. They transformed one woman's private crisis into a civic catastrophe. But to understand its legacy, we have to step out of the past. We have to ask what this 500-year-old panic tells us about our own world. About how we break down together and the new forms our own social contagions might take. The stages weren't for entertainment, they were for a slow public collapse. The human cost was broken bodies. Accounts from the time, even with their sparse detail, give a grim picture. This wasn't a metaphor. People danced with a frantic energy for days. They pushed far past any limit. The strain was catastrophic. Records suggest heart attacks, strokes right there in the streets. Their systems just gave out. At the peak, it's believed the plague claimed up to 15 people a day. They weren't victims of a virus, but of exhaustion. The suffering was visible. They danced until the skin on their feet tore open, leaving the cobblestones stained. Their movements became a grotesque parody, a compulsion that overrode pain, that overrode survival instinct. Their minds, trapped in whatever trance held them, were often separate from the agony. It reached a point where physical restraint became necessary. Bystanders or guards had to forcibly hold people down. To stop them from rising again to continue that rhythm. This fact underscores the event's nature. This wasn't a festival that got out of hand. It was a pathological event with deadly consequences. It forces a confrontation, a truth about the connection between mind and body. Psychological distress at a certain collective intensity can manifest in physically devastating ways. The human body, under extreme duress, can be commanded to march itself to the point of failure. The dancers were in a feedback loop, fear-compelled movement. Movement bred exhaustion. Exhaustion deepened the trance, making the pain distant. Their ordeal is a stark lesson in the physical limits of our form. It shows that the stories we tell ourselves, the fears we share, don't just live in our thoughts. Under the right terrible conditions, they can write their script directly onto our flesh and bones. This realization about the body's vulnerability under mass stress leads to a final question. How did it end, and what was left of the city when the last dancer finally fell still? The music was supposed to help. It was meant to be a cure, but instead it became a conductor. The city gave it a steady, lively rhythm, and that rhythm gave the chaos a structure. You have a room of people in distress, each moving in their own frantic way. It's disturbing, but it's isolated. Then you add a drumbeat, a melody, and those separate motions start to sync up. The music gave them a common pulse, a template, something the afflicted bodies could latch onto, and that synchronization did something. It turned individual suffering into a collective performance. The dance wasn't just a symptom anymore. It was a coordinated event, and that coordination made it more powerful, more hypnotic, far more contagious to watch. But the musicians weren't the only ones watching. The real amplifier was the crowd. Word spread about the spectacle. It drew hundreds of onlookers into the squares, to the edges of the stages. They came with horror, pity, morbid curiosity, maybe a fearful belief they were seeing something supernatural, and their gaze, their very presence, did something critical. It validated the experience. For someone trapped in that dance, the sea of watching faces confirmed this was real, that it was significant. Their attention turned suffering into spectacle. And spectacle demands participants. That created a feedback loop. The music organized the movement, making it compelling to watch. The crowd gathered to watch, and their focus made the behavior seem more legitimate. More like something to join, not flee. In that pressurized space, the line between observer and participant could blur. Someone on the edge, already strained by hunger and fear, might feel their own anxiety resonate with the rhythm. They might see a friend in the throng of dancers. The social pull, the unconscious mimicry could become overwhelming. Joining might have felt, in that moment, like the only way to belong to the only thing happening. It was a perverse form of community, forged in shared extremity. That dynamic between performer and audience sits the engine of so many mass phenomena. It's not just what's on the stage, it's the energy flowing back from the crowd. You see it at a political rally, the cascading emotion in a sports stadium. The crowd's belief fuels the action, and the action justifies the crowd's belief. In Strasbourg, that loop was built with literal stages and physical bodies. Today, our stages are often digital. The rhythmic music is the relentless, algorithmically driven feed. The crowd of spectators is the vast, invisible audience of likes and shares and comments. A modern idea can spiral with speed, not because it's inherently true, but because the platform provides the rhythm and the audience provides the validating gaze. The same mechanisms that drew an onlooker into the dance in 1518 can draw someone online into a wave of outrage, a viral challenge, a shared conspiracy. The need to sync up, to be part of the significant event, hasn't changed. We've just built more powerful tools to orchestrate it. So understanding Strasbourg isn't just about diagnosing a medieval mystery. It's about recognizing a permanent vulnerability in how we connect and how those connections can sometimes carry us away. Strasbourg's tragedy wasn't alone. You had other communities across Europe speaking this same desperate language with their bodies. For a wider view, you can look to southern Italy, to the region of Apulia. From about the 15th to the 17th centuries, something called Tarantism appeared there. The story was different, but underneath it was very familiar. It centered on the bite of a tarantula spider. People, usually women, would say they'd been bitten. Then they'd fall into a deep melancholy or listlessness or agitation. The cure wasn't a doctor's potion. It was a specific, frantic dance. The person had to dance, sometimes for days, to a very particular kind of lively, rhythmic music. The idea was the vigorous movement would sweat the spider's poison out. Musicians would be hired, neighbors would gather, and this ritual would go on until the dancer collapsed from exhaustion, supposedly cured. On the surface, it looks like simple folk medicine. A physical cause, the bite, and a physical cure, the dance. But looking deeper, historians and anthropologists see something more. Many of those bitten had no physical mark. The poison was often a metaphor. Tarantism gave a culturally accepted outlet for distress that had no other name. In a very structured, often repressive society, especially for women, this ritual offered a temporary license. It allowed a public display of otherwise forbidden feelings, frustration, grief, pent-up energy. The dance was a sanctioned frenzy, a way to scream through your feet. Put Tarantism beside the dancing plague of Strasbourg, and patterns emerge. Both were somatic idioms. That's a term for a physical language, a way a culture expresses shared psychological pain through shared bodily behavior. Strasbourg's idiom was framed as divine punishment or a medical imbalance, expressed as a compulsive, chaotic jig. Apulia's idiom was framed as a spider's bite, expressed as a musically guided, ritualized dance. The vessel was different, a saint's curse versus a spider's venom, but the contents were similar. Unbearable social stress seeking a physical release. This shows these events weren't freakish one-offs. They were extreme examples of a universal human process. When words fail or are forbidden, the body finds a way to speak. The specific form is shaped entirely by culture. The people of medieval Europe had a vocabulary of saints, humors, demonic influences. So their distress manifested through that lens. The result was a dance that looked like penance or plague. In southern Italy, the cultural script involved animal spirits and purgative rituals, so the distress took that shape. Seeing them together changes them. They're not just historical curiosities. They become profound evidence. They show how tightly our mental well-being is woven into our social fabric. And how, when that fabric tears under pressure, the tear can appear first not in our words but in our movements. These dances were the body's testimony to conditions the mind couldn't otherwise articulate. They tell us that trauma and constraint, when shared by a community, often demand a collective performance. A performance that, centuries later, we're only starting to decipher. Mainstream medicine in 1518 was built on a system from Galen, an ancient Greek physician. It was called Humorism. Human health was governed by 4 essential fluids. The humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each one had its own qualities. Blood was hot and moist, phlegm was cold and moist, black bile was cold and dry. Yellow bile was hot and dry. A healthy person kept these 4 in a perfect balance. Any illness was just an imbalance, too much of one or not enough of another. Your symptoms showed which humor was out of sync. So when the city physicians saw the dancers, their frantic movements, their lack of control, the diagnosis seemed clear. This was an excess of hot blood. The blood had overheated, boiling in the veins, forcing the limbs into wild motion. The cure followed from the disease. If the problem was too much hot blood, the solution was to purge it, to burn it off. The body needed to dance the excess out, to sweat and exhaust the imbalance away. This wasn't a random guess, it was standard medical practice. That's why they built the stages and hired the musicians. They weren't encouraging madness. They were administering what they believed was a rigorous treatment, trying to rebalance the humors. But this medical framework overlapped with another, more powerful system. The supernatural. For every physical imbalance, there was a potential spiritual cause, demonic possession, the wrath of a saint like Saint Vitus, or the direct punishment of an angry god for the sins of the community. The alignment of planets could also exert a malign influence. These explanations weren't seen as superstition. They were part of a complete worldview, where the physical and spiritual realms were constantly interacting. So a person or a whole city could be sick in body and in soul at the same time. This created a paralyzing confusion for the authorities. Faced with the dancing, they had to choose. Was this a medical crisis to be treated by physicians, or a spiritual one requiring priests and exorcisms? Their initial choice, the medical, humor-based cure, proved catastrophic, and when that failed, they had no coherent plan. They had to pivot entirely from a theory of hot blood to a theory of cold condemnation. This dual framework meant they were always reacting, always one step behind. They had tools, but the tools were for different problems, and they didn't know which problem they actually had. The profound confusion in Strasbourg highlights a dilemma. What do we do when reality serves us an event that shatters our explanatory models? When the things we use to make sense of the world, our science, our religion, offer only contradictory advice? The leaders weren't incompetent, they were trapped between a medical book that said dance more and a religious doctrine that whispered you have sinned. In that gap between competing truths, the plague found all the space it needed to consume a city. The dancing didn't just stop, it faded, like a fever breaking. The records from that summer go quiet. There's no clear answer, but you can piece together a likely sequence: human action and simple exhaustion working together. The city's leaders had seen their medical cure fail, so they reversed course completely. They took down the stages for good. They banned the musicians. They outlawed the public gatherings. That was a critical shift. They stopped feeding the spectacle. By removing the sanctioned platform, they withdrew the social permission. The permission that had turned private suffering into a public event. The feedback loop was broken. Their next move was to redirect that energy outward. Accounts suggest they organized official pilgrimages. They escorted groups of the afflicted to the shrine of Saint Vitus in the nearby town of Zaban. This was a masterstroke of medieval psychology. It acknowledged the spiritual dimension, the one the people believed in. It provided a structured ritual. To replace the chaotic, self-destructive one, a pilgrimage has a beginning, a path, a destination. It channels compulsion into ceremony. The act of leaving Strasbourg, of walking away from the site of the trauma, likely had a profound effect. It physically removed people from the environment where the social contagion thrived. It replaced the frantic, circular dance with a purposeful, linear journey. They were still moving their bodies, but now toward a place of hope for healing, not toward collapse. And then, time itself was a physician. The sheer physical toll meant their bodies could not sustain the frenzy indefinitely. Many had already succumbed. Those who remained were pushed to the edge. Their systems were shutting down. The body's need for rest is a biological imperative. It eventually overrides even the most powerful psychological drives. The season was changing too. The intense heat of July and August began to give way. To the cooler days of early autumn, the environmental pressure eased, so the end arrived not with a bang but with a slow, collective sigh. The last dancers isolated without the crowd, and the music finally stilled. The streets of Strasbourg grew quiet again, but it was a haunted quiet. This ambiguous, messy conclusion is itself a lesson. Complex social phenomena rarely have clean endings. They don't get solved like an equation, they dissipate. The conditions that created them, the famine, the fear, the faith, the social strain, they gradually evolved. The collective narrative shifted. The story changed from "we must dance the fever out" to "we must seek Saint Vitus's grace." That new story provided a different script. One that led out of the city instead of circling within it. The dancing plague didn't end because someone found the right medicine. It ended because the society around it changed its mind. It stopped reflecting the panic back at itself and instead offered a different path. The energy of the crowd was redirected, and without that sustaining gaze, the performance could not go on. This is how many of our own modern panics subside. Not when a fact definitively proves them wrong, but when the social environment stops amplifying them. When the crowd's attention slowly turns elsewhere. The silence in Strasbourg wasn't the end. It was the start of a long echo. The dancing plague didn't stay in the history books. It moved into art and literature. It found a second life there as a symbol. For centuries, artists and writers have been drawn to it. They saw more than a medical oddity. They saw a metaphor for the human condition. One of the earliest interpretations came from Pieter Bruegel the Elder. In the 1560s, he painted works like the Wedding Dance and the Peasant Dance. They aren't literal scenes from Strasbourg, but they capture the spirit, that raw, unrestrained physicality, a communal celebration right on the edge of chaos. His peasants have these exaggerated movements, flushed faces. They embody a kind of release. It's joyful, but also slightly terrifying. They dance with a fervor that suggests an escape. An escape from daily hardship, a temporary abandonment of all the usual rules. In those paintings, you see the artistic imagination grappling with the same energy. The energy that fueled the plague, framing it as a basic human impulse, a dangerous one. Centuries later, the story came back. The writer Heinrich Heine referenced it. Modern novelists were captivated by its psychological depth. John Waller wrote a historical novel, The Dancing Plague. It reconstructs the event, uses it to explore how belief and environment can warp reality. Other authors used it as a starting point to look at mass hysteria, the power of suggestion, that thin line between devotion and madness. In these stories, the frantic dancing on the cobblestones becomes a lens, a way to examine how individuals disappear into a crowd, how reason dissolves under shared pressure, how a society can suddenly lose its rhythm violently. The plague's legacy goes into music and film too. It often symbolizes uncontrollable ecstasy or societal collapse. It's a ready-made allegory for any time people seem swept up by a force they don't understand. Financial mania, political fervor, the viral spread of an idea online. These artistic retellings aren't just dramatizations, they're a form of analysis. Ongoing analysis. Each painting, each novel, each song is an attempt to answer the question Strasbourg left behind. Why? By reimagining the event, artists transpose it. They put it into new contexts. They ask what the dancing means for their time. Is it a warning about the madness of crowds, a testament to the human spirit's search for release? A dark parable about the consequences of repression. In that way, the dancing plague achieved a kind of immortality. It went beyond its specific historical moment. It became a timeless story about control and freedom, order and chaos, the individual and the collective. The people of Strasbourg couldn't stop their own bodies from moving. But in doing that, they created a story that would never stop moving through culture. Their physical compulsion became our cultural fascination, a perpetual reminder. A reminder of how fragile civilization structures really are, and what strange shapes our shared anxieties can take when they finally break through. Strasbourg's cobblestones are quiet now, but the psychological blueprint that's still active. We don't see people dancing to collapse in town squares anymore. But mass psychogenic illness, that shared physical expression of deep stress, it's still here. It just wears different costumes. Take the classroom. There are documented cases. A strange symptom spreads through a school. No medical cause is ever found. One student feels dizzy, faints, then another, then a dozen. Health officials investigate. They test the air, the water, the building materials. Everything comes back normal, but the suffering is real. They aren't pretending. Their bodies are responding to an invisible trigger. Not a toxin, a shared anxiety. Maybe it's exam pressure, a traumatic event in the community, a rumor that takes root. The body finds a way to speak the distress the mind can't articulate. And in a school, that close, socially contagious environment, that language can spread fast. We see it in workplaces too, factories, offices. A group of workers suddenly reports the same unexplained symptoms. Headaches, nausea, skin rashes. Again, environmental tests find nothing. The cause is often traced back, a climate of intense stress, poor management. A deep-seated fear about safety. The physical symptom becomes a collective cry for help, a somatic signal that conditions are unbearable. Today there's a new amplifier. Far more powerful than a stage in a horse market, social media, digital platforms create virtual crowds, unimaginable size. Algorithms act like relentless, rhythmic music. They curate our fears and feed them back, creating synchronized waves of panic. A viral post about a health risk, even if baseless, can trigger a wave of reported symptoms in thousands who read it. That's sometimes called the Nocebo effect, the evil twin of placebo. If you believe something will harm you, your body can sometimes produce real signs of that harm. Online belief is contagious, and symptoms can follow. We see it in everything from mystery ailments linked to new tech to waves of anxiety after a shared traumatic news event. The medium changed from word of mouth to the global feed, but the mechanism of social contagion is ancient. The clinical term for an individual version is conversion disorder. Significant psychological stress converts into a physical symptom, sudden paralysis, blindness with no neurological damage. When this happens to a group, it's mass psychogenic illness. The key lesson from 1518 is that dismissing these events as all in their heads isn't just cruel, it's incorrect. The suffering is physically real, the pain is authentic. The challenge is diagnosing the source, which lies in the shared emotional environment, not in a blood test. This is where Strasbourg's tragedy offers a warning about response. The city's initial reaction was to prescribe more of the very behavior that was the problem, a catastrophic misdiagnosis. Their later shift to a more holistic, spiritually informed response. The pilgrimages showed a glimmer of understanding. They stopped fighting the symptom and started addressing the underlying climate of fear. For us, the imperative is clear. When faced with a modern outbreak of unexplained symptoms in a community, the answer isn't ridicule or punishment. It isn't to simply tell people to stop, it's empathetic investigation. It requires looking beyond the laboratory to the social and psychological landscape. What are the unspoken stresses? What fears are circulating? What does this physical symptom allow a person or a community to express or escape from? Effective intervention means creating safety, reducing anxiety, offering healthy outlets for stress, not amplifying the panic with sensational coverage or authoritative demands that only deepen the helplessness. The dancing plague teaches that the human mind, in concert with others, is a powerful reality-shaping force. It can craft poisons and cures from belief alone. In an age of digital crowds and global anxiety, understanding this old blueprint isn't just about history. It's a necessary tool for navigating the strange, shared realities we continue to build together. One thought, one fear, and one click at a time. The brain is built for connection. It's a social instrument, and there's a system for that: mirror neurons. These are cells that were identified in the 90s. They fire when you do something. They also fire when you watch someone else do that same thing. You see a hand reach for a cup, and the part of your brain for reaching activates. You see someone flinch, and your own pain areas might light up. It's the basis for empathy. For learning by watching, for catching a yawn, it's an evolutionary adaptation. It lets us understand intentions quickly. It lets us learn skills. It lets groups synchronize. But in Strasbourg, under that pressure, this same system might have failed. The dancers on stage weren't just a show. They were a continuous signal, a broadcast of frantic movement to hundreds of people. People whose brains were already primed by fear and exhaustion. For someone filled with dread, watching that dance could start a cascade. Their mirror system would fire, simulating the movements inside. Their own physical tension from hunger and stress could resonate with that simulation, and in a mind looking for an outlet for a script, that internal simulation might cross a line. It could go from observation to compulsion. The line between seeing the dance and needing to join it could vanish. That's the engine of social contagion. It's not a conscious choice, it's an unconscious synchronization. We're always subtly mimicking the people around us, their posture, their speech, their mood. It's how we build rapport, how we feel part of a group. Normally, this is gentle, it's regulated, but under extreme collective stress, those controls can break down. The need to belong, to align with the group's reality, becomes overpowering. In Strasbourg, belonging meant joining the dance, aligning meant moving to that same frantic rhythm. For some, it might have felt like the only way to make their internal chaos match the external chaos. A terrible, logical way to not feel alone in the fear. We see softer versions of this constantly. Laughter spreading in a theater, a collective gasp, a mood moving through an office. Those are social contagions of emotion. Strasbourg was a social contagion of behavior, amplified to a lethal point. The dancing was high arousal. It was visible, that made it a powerful vector. Impossible to ignore, and for brains wired to mirror and to seek group cohesion, it became tragically irresistible. This vulnerability isn't a flaw. It's a feature of our species. It allows for culture, for coordinated rescue, for shared joy, but it also opens a door where a community's anxiety can turn into a physical script. When the shared story is one of punishment and panic, the mirrored behavior becomes a dance of despair. Our greatest strength, this deep neural capacity to connect, holds within it the blueprint for our most bewildering collapse. The records from that summer are thin, and they're biased, of course, but there's a detail that keeps coming up. Many of the first to join her out in the streets were women. That's not just a note, it's a way in. To see it, you have to picture that world, a medieval city. The rules for men and women weren't just different, they were unequal. For a woman from the laboring class, life was narrow. Her voice in public didn't count. Her body, her behavior were watched closely. Anger, deep grief, spiritual passion, these were seen as disruptive. Dangerous even. So where does that pressure go when words aren't an option, when protest isn't possible? Sometimes it finds a release through the only thing left. The physical self, a public breakdown like frantic dancing. It was terrifying, but it existed in a gray area. People could see it a few ways, all of them familiar. It could be a medical affliction, a humoral imbalance that removed some blame, or a spiritual event, possession, divine punishment that put it in a religious framework. Or it could be seen as madness, which brought pity, not punishment. In any case, the behavior, while alarming, became a kind of communication, a somatic cry. A performance of distress, written in movement because no other script was allowed. For a brief, terrible window, the dancing woman had the absolute attention of her community. She stopped the normal flow. She became the central figure. In a society that usually made her invisible, this was a form of agency, a devastating one. Her suffering became a spectacle, impossible to ignore. This reading, this gendered layer, it doesn't contradict the other explanations. It ties into them. The psychological contagion spread more easily among people who shared the same constraints. The religious idea of Saint Vitus's dance as penance, it resonated with those conditioned to bear guilt. The economic despair weighed heaviest on those with the fewest rights. So when you picture those first dancers in the July heat, you're not just seeing victims of an illness. You're likely seeing individuals whose bodies became a stage for a protest against hunger, against fear, against a silence that had become unbearable. Their dance was a language of last resort, spoken in a time when, for many, it was the only language left. That shifts the plague from a purely pathological event to a social one. It shows how societal structures don't just shape our lives, they can shape the very form of our breakdowns. The constraints of gender, class, belief in 16th century Strasbourg, they didn't just surround the dancing plague. They helped sculpt its choreography. The stories were already there in the collective imagination. Centuries before Strasbourg, dance in mythology was never just movement. It was a conduit, a way for forces beyond human will to move through people. The ancient Greek Maenads, the followers of Dionysus, in their myths, these women were driven into ecstatic dances in the wilderness. Their worship was so powerful it blurred devotion and madness. They weren't celebrating, they were surrendering to a divine force that erased the self, that led to transformation. That archetype is profound. Dance as a direct line to the supernatural, a way for a god to possess a community, to rewrite its rules through motion. Then there's the Pied Piper of Hamelin, a folk tale from medieval Germany, not far from Strasbourg in spirit. Here, music, the close cousin to dance, holds a compulsive power. The piper's tune doesn't just entertain. It commands, it pulls the children from their homes, leading them away, a punishment for the town's broken promise. The story is about a debt unpaid, a social contract violated. The children, moving in a trance, are victims of a collective sin. Their loss is a physical manifestation of the town's failure. These aren't random tales, they're cultural blueprints. They establish a clear connection between compulsive, group movement and forces like divine ecstasy, or communal punishment, or a loss of control to an outside power. For the people of 1518, living in a world where every storm could be a sign, these stories weren't just entertainment, they were part of the air they breathed. They provided a framework, a way to understand the incomprehensible. When Frau Troffea began to dance and others followed, they weren't consciously acting out a myth. But the myths had shaped the landscape of their fears. The event didn't need to be explained from scratch. The community had a vocabulary for it. This looks like the wrath of a saint, they might have thought. This is a punishment for our sins, like the piper. This is a frenzy sent upon us, like the Maenads. The templates made the terrifying event recognizable. It fit a pattern. This transforms the dancing plague from a bizarre anomaly into something with a terrifying lineage. A historical moment where folklore stepped off the page and into the streets. The archetypes of lost control and divine retribution, carried in story and song, found a new expression in the bodies of a starving, fearful populace. It shows that in times of extreme crisis, when logic fails, the human mind doesn't spiral into chaos at random. It falls back on the oldest stories it knows. The people of Strasbourg were not just dancing. They were, in a tragic way, performing a role written for them by centuries of storytelling. Their reality was shaped by the myths they had inherited. The stories we tell about the world can, under the right pressures, become the scripts we live by. The world was getting colder. Historians call it the Little Ice Age, this period settling over Europe in the late Middle Ages. It wasn't a sudden freeze, but a long stretch of cooler temperatures, unpredictable weather that went on for centuries. The effects were slow, relentless. For societies built on farming, it was devastating. Growing seasons got shorter. Spring frosts wouldn't leave. Summer rains, they'd either become these destructive downpours or they'd just vanish. Harvests failed, not just one year, but several in a row. The famine in Strasbourg in 1518, that wasn't some isolated bad luck. It was a local crisis happening inside a continent-wide environmental shift. The basic foundation of life, growing food, was becoming unstable. And when survival is threatened by something that vast, that indifferent like the climate, a deep insecurity sets in. You can't negotiate with the weather, you can't pray it away or punish it. It just is. That powerlessness creates a specific anxiety. It scrambles all the old rules. The contract between hard work and reward, it breaks. A farmer could do everything right, till the soil perfectly, and still watch the crops die from an unseasonal cold. In a world like that, misfortune has to have a reason. The mind can't accept a random, impersonal catastrophe, so it looks for a cause it can understand. And that search often turns inward or upward. Maybe the failing harvests were a sign of God's displeasure. maybe the community had sinned and the cold was the punishment. Or maybe malicious spirits were at work, blighting the land, so the climate crisis became a spiritual crisis, and the dancing plague, seen this way, looks like a physical symptom of that deep, climate-induced trauma. A society feeling literally uprooted its food source vanishing, and metaphorically uprooted its whole understanding of the world failing. It might express that dislocation through the body. That frantic, compulsive movement, it can be seen as a manifestation of the rootlessness, a desperate, unconscious mimicry of a world that had lost its stable rhythm. The dancers weren't just moving from exhaustion or fear. They were acting out the instability of their entire reality. Their bodies jerking without control, they mirrored the erratic weather that had destroyed their security. And this link between environmental stress and social breakdown, it isn't just in the past. We see it in other historical periods where climatic changes came before great unrest, migration, cultural transformation. When the ground beneath a society shifts, literally or figuratively, the people on it can be thrown into a kind of collective vertigo. Strasbourg's dance was one form that vertigo took. A terrifying physical performance of a community struggling to find its footing in a world that had suddenly, for reasons beyond their comprehension, turned cold. We have a name for the dancing plague now, mass psychogenic illness. It makes sense to us. It fits with what we know about the mind and the body, but we have to stop there for a second. Because when we look back and give an old event a new name from our time, that's called retrospective diagnosis, and it's a revealing thing to do. Back in the 16th century, the people in Strasbourg had their own way of seeing it. They thought it was a punishment from God, or maybe an imbalance in the body's fluids. Then, in the 1900s, with new science, the popular idea became poisoning. From a fungus on the rye, today we think about social psychology. Every era looks back and finds something that reflects its own worries, its own scientific confidence. We try to fit the past into our current boxes. We try to make that strange, terrifying event fit neatly into what we know now, but the past doesn't fit easily. The people in 1518 didn't live through it as a case of mass psychogenic illness. They lived it as something physical and spiritual and communal. Their fear was about saints and demons, not about social contagion from a textbook. When we put our modern label on it, we can lose the rough texture of their world. We can turn their deep, layered suffering into just a clean academic term. That doesn't mean our modern ideas are wrong. They're powerful, they're plausible. But they're incomplete. They're one layer of truth seen through the lens of our own time. The real lesson here is humility. It shows us that understanding history is always a kind of conversation between what the evidence says and what our own worldview lets us see. The dancing plague isn't a puzzle with one final answer. It's a mirror, and every generation that looks into it sees a different face. Our explanations tell a story, not just about 1518, but about what we believe today, about what moves people, about what makes a society break. That's the lasting power of this old mystery. It refuses to be solved, because in refusing, it keeps asking us the most important questions about ourselves. The record from that summer is just fragments. It's not a story. We have a few lines from city council ledgers, a paragraph in a chronicle, maybe a note from a visiting cleric. These are the voices of authority, men watching from a distance trying to impose order on chaos. They wrote to document expenses, to record decisions, to warn future generations. They didn't write to understand the woman whose feet bled on the stones. There are no diaries from the dancers, no letters home describing the compulsion. Their experience is silent. It's filtered through the fear and confusion of officials who saw them as a problem to be solved. This scarcity shapes everything. It forces historians to become detectives. They read not just the words but the gaps between them. Why did the council pay for musicians on this date but order a pilgrimage on that one? What does the choice of words reveal, calling it a plague, an affliction, a punishment? That choice reveals the writer's own beliefs. The records are brief. So each detail carries immense weight, a mention of the heat, a note about the price of bread. These aren't just background facts. They're clues in a 500-year-old case where the primary witnesses cannot speak. That's why scholars turn to comparative anthropology. They look at similar events in other cultures, like the Tarantella in Italy. They look at medical texts from the period to understand the humor theory. They study sermons to grasp the religious terror. They piece together a context, a world, and then place this strange event inside it, hoping the surroundings will illuminate the mystery at the center. But some pieces are simply gone. The emotional truth of what it felt like to be caught in that dance. The personal stories of those who joined and those who watched a loved one succumb. These are lost to time, and this loss is precisely what makes the dancing plague so haunting. It exists in that shadowy space between history and legend. A few stark facts surrounded by a vast, echoing silence. That silence invites us in. It asks us to wonder, to speculate, to try to bridge the gap with our own imagination. And in doing so, the event becomes more than a historical footnote. It becomes a mirror, reflecting not only the fears of a medieval city, but also our own enduring fascination. A fascination with the moments when human behavior defies all rational explanation. We are left with glimpses, and those glimpses are what keep the story alive, compelling each new generation to ask the same unanswerable question. What truly happened in the streets of Strasbourg? The silence in the records raises a deeper question. Not just what happened, but why, and that question goes beyond history, beyond psychology, into something more basic. The dancing plague directly challenges a very cherished idea. The idea of free will. This is really a story about compulsion. Those people in the streets weren't dancing for pleasure. Their movements were frantic. They were agonizing. They danced until their bodies gave out. So we have to ask, did they choose this in any real sense? Could they have just stopped? The eyewitnesses say they couldn't. They were restrained by others. They collapsed and then got up to keep dancing when the music played. This wasn't a choice. It was a possession, but possessed by what? Not a demon, not in the way they believed, but maybe by something just as powerful. A convergence of invisible forces. The event sits at this very uncomfortable crossroads, where free will, biology, and social pressure all collide. On one side, there's biological determinism. The idea that our bodies, our brain chemistry, our instincts dictate what we do. Was it overheated blood, a toxic fungus, something misfiring in the brain's mirror system? If that's it, then their dancing was a biological event, a symptom like a fever, and you don't choose a fever. On the other side, there's social coercion. The immense weight of a community's belief, its fear, its expectation. In a city that had sanctioned the dance as a cure, where everyone was watching, where joining in might have felt like the only way to belong to that shared reality. In that environment, the individual will can get submerged. The need to conform, to align with the group's story, can override personal desire. You dance because the story your society is telling demands that you dance. This is where the boundary between self and group dissolves. For the dancers, it likely felt deeply personal, a private struggle happening inside their own skin. And yet, those actions were also completely foreign, a script written by the collective anxiety of the whole city. They were both the actor and the audience. The one feeling the compulsion and the one performing it for the community. That duality shatters the myth of the purely autonomous individual. It suggests that who we are, what we do, is never entirely our own. We are always in a dialogue with our biology, with our culture, with the people around us. This philosophical problem didn't end in the 16th century. It echoes now. We see it when a protest turns into a riot. Where does personal conviction end and mob mentality begin? We see it in the terrifying power of cults, where individual identity is taken apart and rebuilt by the group's will. And most pertinently, we see it in our digital world. Social media platforms are engineered to create powerful feedback loops, not unlike the stage in Strasbourg's market. An algorithm provides the rhythm, curating a feed that amplifies specific emotions: outrage, fear, envy. The crowd, now a global audience of millions, provides the validating gaze through likes and shares. In that environment, ideas and behaviors can spread with a viral compulsion. People can find themselves swept into ideological currents, adopting language and beliefs that feel, in the moment, fiercely personal. But are they the result of a sophisticated social psychological chain reaction? A modern choreomania of the mind, the dancing plague forces us to sit with a humbling truth. Our sense of free will, of being the sole authors of our actions, is more fragile than we admit. It exists on a spectrum. Under normal conditions, we navigate our choices. But under extreme pressure, whether from our own stressed biology or from the overwhelming force of a group, that agency can erode. We can become instruments, playing a tune composed by forces we barely understand. This isn't a reason for despair, but for clarity, and maybe for compassion, for the people of Strasbourg and for ourselves. Recognizing this vulnerability is the first step toward guarding against it. It means questioning the rhythms we move to. It means examining the stages we're asked to perform upon. It means listening not just to the music of the crowd, but to the quieter, older rhythm of our own conscience. The dancers of Strasbourg could not stop. But their story asks us to pause and to consider what or who is truly leading our steps. The city council's response is a textbook example of how not to handle a crisis. They saw a terrifying symptom. They applied the most logical solution from their medical textbooks, and they made everything worse, catastrophically worse. This wasn't malice, it was a failure of imagination. They could only see the problem through one lens, the humoral imbalance, so their only tool was to treat the body. They never stopped to ask what might be moving the body in the first place. Their cure, the stages and the music, it gave the chaos a sanctioned platform. It turned private suffering into a public spectacle, and in doing that, it poured fuel on the psychological fire. Their decisive action, meant to project control, actually surrendered control to the very thing they feared. That's the first lesson for any leader facing the unexplainable. Your initial diagnosis is probably incomplete, and acting on it with certainty can be more dangerous than pausing to observe. Effective leadership in the face of collective panic requires a specific kind of humility. It means admitting the old frameworks might not fit the new crisis. For the Strasbourg Council, humility would have looked like consulting not just physicians but quiet observers, community elders, even the sufferers themselves. It would have meant asking different questions, not just what is wrong with their blood, but what is happening in their lives. What fears are they carrying? What stories are they telling each other? That shift from a purely physical model to a social and emotional one, it's incredibly difficult, especially under pressure. Leaders are expected to have answers, not more questions. Yet the most critical answer often lies in understanding the human landscape, not just the clinical one. Managing public perception becomes the next vital task. In Strasbourg, by building stages, the authorities broadcast a message. This dance is important. It is central. It deserves our full attention and resources. They amplified the signal of the crisis. A modern equivalent might be a mayor holding endless press conferences about a mysterious, spreading illness, detailing every symptom without a clear cause, and thereby seeding anxiety in every household. Sometimes the most effective intervention is to calmly diminish the spectacle, not to illuminate it. To provide alternative narratives, safe outlets for community anxiety that don't involve participating in the feared behavior. It's about draining the emotional charge from the event, not adding to it. This story speaks directly to modern leaders in public health, community safety, corporate management. Imagine a school district where students suddenly begin reporting similar, unexplained physical symptoms. The leadership's first instinct might be to shut down the building, call in hazmat teams, issue alarming bulletins. That response, while understandable, could inadvertently validate and spread the psychological distress. A more nuanced approach would involve discreet environmental testing, yes, but paired with quiet, empathetic outreach to students and staff about stress. Academic pressure, social dynamics, it's a dual-track strategy. Address the possible physical causes with rigor, while simultaneously and equally addressing the psychological and social environment with care. The final lesson from Strasbourg is about the goal itself. The council's goal was to stop the dancing. That was their only metric for success. But what if the real goal should have been to heal the city's fear? To address the famine, to offer spiritual comfort, to reduce social tensions. Stopping the dance was just a surface symptom. The deeper sickness was the climate of despair. Modern crises often follow this pattern. A leader focused solely on quelling a protest might miss the profound grievances that sparked it. A company trying to stop employee burnout by mandating fun activities might ignore the toxic workflows that cause the exhaustion. True resolution comes from addressing the underlying conditions, not just suppressing the visible outburst. The dancing plague, in all its tragic strangeness, stands as a 500-year-old case study. It reminds anyone in a position of responsibility that the most powerful forces they will ever confront are not in the environment or the body alone. They are in the shared heart and mind of the community they lead. Even with all our theories, Strasbourg keeps its deepest secrets. Why Frau Troffea? In a city of thousands, why her? Why did she step out onto her street that July day and start that terrible, solitary dance? Historians list the pressures, the famine, the sickness, the fear. But those were shared by everyone. What private hardship, what personal grief, what individual biology aligned in her to create that first spark? We'll never know her inner world. That specific origin is lost, so she's not just the patient zero of the event. She's its first and most intimate mystery. Then there's the form, why dancing? In an era of widespread suffering, why didn't the breakdown take another shape? Why not a weeping plague or a screaming fit? The answer seems to be in the cultural vocabulary of the time. Dance already existed in the medieval mind as a language for extreme states. It was a form of religious ecstasy, a ritual of penance, a folk cure for spider bites in other regions. The template was there in the stories, so when the unconscious mind of a distressed populace needed an outlet, it reached for a pre-existing script. The compulsion didn't invent a new behavior, it amplified one that was already latent. The dance was a recognizable performance, horrifying, but something the community could understand, even in its terror. And why Strasbourg in 1518? Other cities had similar famines. Other communities lived under the same religious anxiety. Yet we have no record of an event of this scale happening anywhere else at that exact moment. This suggests a catastrophic convergence, a perfect and unique storm where every factor, environmental, economic, social, psychological, reached a critical threshold at the same time in that one place. It was a historical singularity, a fleeting alignment of pressures that tipped a whole city into a shared reality, so strange it's never been perfectly replicated. This uncertainty isn't a failure of history, it's the essence of the event's power. The dancing plague resists our modern desire for tidy explanations. It remains a permanent question mark, a story that begins in the middle of a frantic step and ends in a silent collapse with so much left unexplained. It reminds us the human past isn't a solved puzzle. It's a continuous conversation. Some experiences, born from the deepest wells of collective trauma, simply dwell in the realm of profound mystery. They challenge us to sit with the unknown, to acknowledge that the most compelling stories often hold their secrets closest, inviting each new generation to listen, to wonder, and to recognize the limits of what we can ever truly know. 500 years later, the dancers of Strasbourg have a new stage. It's not in the history books anymore. It's in the background of a serious TV show, this ghost of an old madness. It's in the words of songs where that compulsive rhythm becomes a metaphor for modern worry, but maybe the strongest version now is in video games, where you don't just hear about the plague, you're in it. In a game, the dancing plague isn't just a story, it's a rule, a puzzle, a feeling in the air. You might be controlling someone in a town where everyone just starts dancing to exhaustion. The horror isn't described, it's just there, the sound of frantic, bad music. Digital air, characters twitching, spinning, their eyes are empty, their movements are a broken loop, and your goal changes. It's not about fighting. It's about figuring it out. Is it a curse, a poison? Is everyone just believing it into existence? The game makes you walk those empty streets. You read abandoned diaries. You see the desperate town notices. You become part of the dread. These versions always focus on the most unsettling parts, losing control, the horror of a happy thing becoming a death sentence. The slow panic of a society coming apart. They make it a psychological thriller where the enemy is an idea you can catch, and that repackaging does something. It takes this old, complex event and runs it through modern fears about contagion, about influence, about a fragile mind. The original reasons, the famine, the religious guilt, they fade back. But the core themes get louder, the terror of the crowd, the power of suggestion. Where do you stop and the group begins? Those questions don't age, they hit hard now. By telling the story in these new ways, popular culture keeps it alive, not as a fact, but as a living myth. Every film mention, every game level is another telling. It lets a generation that'll never read a medieval chronicle still face the same questions. The ones that haunted Strasbourg. The medium changes, but the conversation keeps going. This 500-year-old strange tale, putting on these digital skins, proves it still has power. It shows our fascination with a community losing its mind isn't just a history lesson. It's a mirror held up again, reflecting our own unease about the forces that move us, even when we don't want to be moved. The dancing plague of 1518. It's not just a story, it's a lens. You hold it up and it fractures. You see poison, you see psychology, you see religion. You see it echo now in our own time. It was a medical mystery, it was a mass delusion, but it was also a case study. The mind, the body, and society, they collided there with force. It shows the power of a collective belief. A shared story that can rewrite reality for a whole town. It shows the physical cost of stress, when hardship has no outlet and then it demands one. It demands a performance, and it shows a human need, a deep need to find meaning in suffering, to shape chaos into a story, even if that story is about punishment. Even if it's about a plague, the dancers of Strasbourg, they're more than historical figures. They're a mirror held up across 500 years. They show our own potential for irrationality, our vulnerability to the rhythm of a crowd, and they show the connections, the profound connections that bind us to each other. In their exhausted movements, there's a truth. We are never truly alone in what we feel. Our joys are contagious, our despairs are contagious, our reality, it's co-authored by the people around us, by the stories we tell each other.